Real estate investment practice problem using Excel. Points explained with the help and use of pivot tables, part 2. Get ready because we're raising the stakes with real estate. Here we are in our Excel worksheet. If you have access to the Excel worksheet, would like to follow along, note that we have 3 tabs on down below, an example tab, a practice tab, and a blank tab. Let's take a look at them, starting off with the example tab, in essence being an answer key, focusing in on the points, the idea of being able to purchase points, purchasing points in order to pay down the interest rate, as it's sometimes called. Concept, fairly straightforward concept, but it can be kind of complex to do comparisons, being that we put money down up front in order to pay down the interest rate, getting a lower interest rate, which could play out to a benefit over the life of the loan and possibly also result in a lower payment amount, which could be useful for budgeting purposes in the future. Some of the questions that you'd want to be asking then is it worthwhile to pay the money up front in order to get the lower payment amount in terms of total dollars? And that'll depend on the length of the loan and so on and so forth. And then 2, how do I compare a loan which has these points available to it to pay down the rate to other loans which may or may not have points or may have different types of points for comparison purposes? And 3, what if I was to sell the home at a shorter period of time? Does that influence the decision? And 4, just remember that there's a couple different things you're thinking about when you're doing these comparisons. There's really 3 scenarios. 1, no points. 2, you take the points that you would have paid to pay down the rate, pay down the loan amount for it. And 3, you use it to pay off the points. So there's actually a lot of kind of scenarios that you can look at through here. Now, in the prior presentation, we worked with this looking at full amortization tables that have 360 months involved, which can be quite tedious when you're trying to look at these different types of options. You might say, holy donuts, right? Isn't there an easier way to do this? And an easier way might be the use of the pivot tables and try to look at it on a 30-year type of basis, constructing pivot table data from the amortization table, as we've seen in prior presentations. So we'll try to simplify just looking and analyzing the concept of what the points do here, and then you can use those concepts to make comparisons in different types of scenarios for whatever your needs will be. So we're going to focus here on just understanding the points again and working with our pivot tables to do so. The practice tab on the second tab will have some formatted cells, so you can do less formatting if you'd like to practice there. The blank tab is you're going to have a lot of the blank area on the right-hand side to populate the information. That's where we will be working here. Okay, so the information, we're going to have the home at the $200,000. We're not going to put a down payment just to not confuse things. So we're just going to basically say the loan is $200,000. Years are going to be 30 years, months, then 30 times 12 or 360. The rate is going to be at the 5% starting point before we pay down. Now I'm going to add the point scenario here to try to put that in our worksheet. I'll do it a little bit more quickly because we saw it in the prior presentations. So I'm going to say points. Oftentimes we might have like 1 to 3 points that might be available as kind of standard of what you would commonly possibly see. Let's imagine 1 point to start off with. Then we want to see, well, what's going to be the rate decrease if we purchase the points? So what is the rate decrease per point? We're going to imagine it to be 0.0025, or in other words, 0.25%. So if I go to the home tab, numbers, percentify, add a couple decimals, 0.25, that's 0.0025 or 0.25%. And then we're going to say, okay, well, what's going to be the fee that we're going to have? The point fee. And the fee, a point means 1% of the loan amount. The loan amount is $200,000, so 1 point would be then $2,000. We're going to try to calculate that with the data up top, so it'll move around as we change things. So the 200,000 times the points of 1 point times 0.01 because it should be 0.01 or 1% of 200,000. That should give us 2,000. If I change my 1 here to 2, I should get 4,000. Looks like it's functioning as we would expect it to. So then we want to say, well, what's going to be the rate going to be? What if I pay like the 6,000? What's my rate after points? How much did I pay down the rate? We paid it down 0.25 times 3, 0.75. 5 minus the 0.75 would be 4.25. Let's see if we could do that calculation down here so that we can have it adjusted with the points. We're going to pick up the rate up above minus the 0.25 per point times the number of points that we're going to have, which is going to be 3 points. And then we'll say enter. Let's percentify that. Number group, percentify it, add a couple decimals. We're at the 4.25. If we had 2 points, it goes down to 4.5, 1 point, 4.75. That looks good. The next thing I would like to do is make sure that my payment calculation and my table are calculating properly based on this 4.25 up top instead of the 5%. I'm going to make this blue just so we can make sure to change that. So I'm going to double click on the payment here, and that rate right there, it's pulling from the 5%. I would like to make sure it's pulling from the 4.25. So I'm going to delete this, and I'm going to put the 4.25 there and enter. And if you're adjusting your table, you also want to make sure your table, the payments populating, the interest cell, however, might be pulling from the 5%. You want to move it down to the 4.25. So that's B7 needs to be then this cell, B12, F4 on the keyboard, $ before the B and 12, and enter. Then we'll simply copy that down, double clicking on the fill handle. If done correctly, we should get down to 0 at the bottom of the amortization table. So that looks good. So we've got that. Now notice that we're still starting with the $200,000 loan amount, even though in this case we're saying we're paying another $6,000 in fees. So the question then is going to be, well, that 4.25 doesn't really represent in total the costs and the interest because it's only calculating the interest. So how can I roll that into one number on a percent basis so that I can use that one number to be comparing to other things, other loan options that we might have? For that, we're going to call it the effective rate that we'll calculate up here. This is going to be our comparative rate. It's got limitations because it's an effective rate over the life, and that's what we'll concentrate on now, but it's a useful tool. So let's calculate this. This is going to be equal to the rate, shift 9. The number of periods is going to be 360, comma. The payment's going to be this payment we just calculated down below, and that needs to be negative, by the way, negative. And then comma, the present value. If we just take the loan amount, we'll get back to that 4.25. Let's start there, and then we'll adjust it, closing it up. That would give us the monthly amount times 12 to get the yearly amount and enter. Adding percent, number group, percentify, decimals, we're at the 4.25. Let's give us the twist. What's the twist? Twist happening. B4, we're going to change that to, let's say, B4 minus the 6,000. So B4 minus the 6,000, representing the fact that we got 200,000, but then we had to pay the 6,000. So that gives us an effective rate of the 4.51. So if I was to compare, for example, to other loans that didn't have points involved, then that would be a more comparable number. Not a perfect number, doesn't tell us what we need to know in all situations, but more comparable. Okay, so now let's say, well, now let's think about that and get an idea of what the points mean. To do that, we're going to be adding then the pivot table just to see how we can use a pivot table and work on kind of a yearly basis as opposed to using this giant amortization table. So I'm going to go over and say, let's go to the insert. Now we've done this in the past. I'm going to do it quickly. If you want to see how to insert this table in a slower detail, you could take a look at prior presentations, but we're just going to insert the pivot table. We're going to put it into the existing area. Location's going to be up top in K1. We want to be in K1 and OK. There we have it. Let's populate our pivot table. Years, pulling that to the left-hand side. Then I'm going to say payments, interest, loan, and loan balance. That'll give us just a yearly breakout instead of 360 periods. And let's see what we can do with that to kind of figure our point situation. So I'm going to then take the sum, value these fields, and let's say we want to make this number format, currency, brackets, no $, pennies gone, okay. Interest, same thing. We want to value it, number format, currency, brackets, no $, pennies gone, okay. Then field value, next one, number format, currency, brackets, no $, pennies gone, okay. One more time, balance, value field, this time not the sum, but the min for the loan balance, then format the numbers, currency, brackets, $sign gone, pennies removed, okay. I know I did that fast, but again, we've done this in prior presentations, so I'm going to try to do this a little quickly here. Adding the brackets, home tab, we're going to go font group, bracketize it, borders. Let's make it then bolden and bolden it. Put a header up top and make these fancy. Home tab, font, let's make it black and white. Let's go ahead and wrap the text. Let's center it, and then we'll squish these headers together a little bit so that we can see it on less space, and then we'll center to make that centerized. Okay, so now we have our information on a year-by-year breakout, and we'll do a similar kind of analysis we did last time and see if we can approximate it with just basically 30 years and work with that to kind of make it an easier calculation if we need to analyze some of these loans. So let's see, I'm going to minimize this one a little bit, and we're going to do our IRR calculation on 30 years rather than 360 and get an approximation for it. So let's start off same scenario, no points to give us our baseline scenario, to think about what these points are doing and what the interest rate means and so on, cash flow, and then we're going to start off with the 5%. I'll pick up the 5%. I'm going to type in the 5%. 5%. And then let's go to the numbers, percentify that, and then add a couple decimals. Selecting these items, we're going to go to the Home tab, font, black, white, and then we're going to wrap it and center it. There we have it. Let's add some numbers. We're going to say this is going to be 0, 1, 2. And now we're just copying down to 30 periods instead of 360s. Here's where the benefit happens here. We're just going down to 30. We're not going all crazy with 360 like holy donut. And then we're going to go to the alignment and center. Let's make this one a little bit smaller. And then we're going to start on the first one for our example. Let's start off with no points. So I'm going to change my cell over here to 0 points. That brings it back to 5%. I'm going to check that my amortization table is correct by going down to the bottom and just checking that it goes to 0. That's an indication, or one indication, that it looks like it's doing what it should. And then I'm going to go back up top. I'm going to refresh the pivot table. Right click on the pivot table, refresh it. So my payments on a yearly payment should be the sum of these, 12,844 each year. That looks right. And then I'm going to go over here and do my cash flow just on a yearly basis. We're going to start off now. I'm not going to use formulas because I can't reference this cell because I'm going to change it when I jump from scenario to scenario. Last time, when we copied and pasted a whole nother amortization table, we could do that. So we have to hard code or type in the numbers over here, which is one of the limitations of this method. So we're going to say we're going to have the 200,000. Payments are going to be, I'm going to put negative 12884, and then I'll just double click and copy that down. There we have it. And then I'm going to do my present value calculations just on a yearly basis as opposed to on a monthly basis. So it's a little bit easier. We'll say negative present value, shift 9. The rate I'm going to pick up from the 5% up top, not from the 5% to the left, because I'm going to change the 5% to the left, and I'd still like to pick it up from a reference, so I like to pick it up from somewhere. You could type in 0.05 as well, but I prefer picking it up here. And then I'm going to make that is a yearly rate, so we don't have to divide it by 12 here because this one period represents 1 year, comma. Number of periods is going to be, that's not a comma. Number of periods is going to be that 1. That represents 1 year now. It's not an annuity for 2 commas to get us to the future value of that 12,884 and enter. So that means if we discount the 12,884, which is the yearly amount that we're going to pay, even though we're paying it monthly, if we just combine it to one amount we pay per year and discount it back by 5% for 1 year, we'd get 12,270. Let's do it one more time and then copy it down. Negative present value, shift 9, the rate 5%, F4 on the keyboard so I can copy it down this time, comma. Number of periods is now 2, representing this time 2 years, not 2 months, comma, comma, to get to the future value, picking up the 12,884. That means that 12,884 discounted at 5% back 2 years will give us 11,686. If I copy that down by simply double clicking, it'll copy it down. I'm going to copy it up as well, which will just give us that 200,000 because we're at time period 0. It didn't give us an, oh, that's because the 5% moved. 5% moved. You could just say enter 200,000 there as well. 200,000. If we go all the way down, we sum this up now. We got our totals equals the SUM and bracket this. So we're going to say there it is. There's our cash flow. So there's our cash flow, a lot easier to sum up. And if I sum up the present values, we get then to not exactly 0, right? And when we did this on a yearly basis, we got to 0 because that would be more exact. Right here, we're doing something not quite exact, right? And so if I take the IRR, if we did this last time with the full 360, we would have got 5%. This time we're going to get something a little bit different that equals the IRR. And then we'll take the sum of these, or not the sum, but, bracketing them up. Make that a percent, number group, percentify it. You don't have to divide it by 12 because this is, we're on a yearly basis. So we would get 5%. So you get an approximation if you're working with a yearly amount, which you could do with the pivot tables. And so let's get an idea of what it means. Well, what if I wanted to compare that to an item with points and try to see what would happen then? Well, what does it mean if I had points that were involved? Let's now add points. So we're going to add the points to 3. That means the rate has now gone from 5% to 4.25 that's used to calculate the amortization table, even though the loan amount is at 200,000, even though we paid 6,000 up front. The effective rate that we calculated here is now that 4.51. Now let's figure out kind of what that effective rate means, or let's approximate it with the use of our calculation on the right to get a better idea of it. To do that, we're going to right click on the pivot table, refresh the pivot table. And so now we got the payments of 11,807. And then I'm going to copy my table headers up top. Going to make column T a little bit shorter here, squish that up, paste the headers. This is going to be for points now. So now we're going to do this with points. The rate is not going to be that rate. So let's do this first. It's going to be 0, 1, 2. Copying that down to 30 periods on down below. Copying it down to 30 instead of 360. Alignment center. We're going to pick up the cash flows. Now the cash flow at the beginning is now going to be equal to the 200,000 minus the 6,000 that we're paying for the points. So in other words, we got 200,000 and then we used it to pay for the home. And then we had to pay at the same time another 600,000 over and above what we needed to pay for the home in order to pay down the rate, as they say. So that means the actual cash flow at time period 0 is 194. And then we're paying out negative 11807 each time period after that point. Copying that down, putting our cursor here and just double clicking. Copy that down. Now the rate we're going to use, I'm going to copy the rate over here just in case it wasn't even. I believe it is, but in case it wasn't, I'm going to copy that 4.25. I'm not going to use a cell reference because it'll change if I change my data input, and simply copy it. And then I'm going to paste it 1, 2, 3 up top, paste 1, 2, 3. So I pick up the exact number right there. Okay, and notice that's not a percent. You'd want to make it a percent, add a couple decimals to it. Now we're going to do our same present value calculation. So I'm going to say negative present value, shift 9, the rate is going to be that 4.25. I'm going to make it absolute, F4 on the keyboard. I don't need to divide it by 12 because we're talking about years now and not months, comma. The payment or the time frame we're going to say is the 1 year, not making it absolute so we can copy it down, comma, comma, because it's not an annuity but present value of 1, picking up the 11,807, meaning if we were to discount back the 11,807 at the 4.25% 1 year, we would get the 11,326. Let's copy that down. simply putting our cursor on it, double clicking on the fill handle, copying it down, and also I'll copy it up one to pick up that 194 like so. And then let's sum this up down here. We're going to say this is going to be the totals. Summing it up equals the SUM. SUM, shift 9. And we will sum that up. And then we'll sum up this column equals the SUM. Summing up the present value column. And of course we don't get something that's going to be 0 here because we have basically a different rate. So let's now calculate the IRR, which should give us what we called the effective rate before. So we'll say this equals the IRR, shift 9. Summing up, don't pick up the total. And then we'll just sum up or pick up this series of numbers. And that will give us, if we then make it a percent, number group percentifying it, adding some decimals, we got the 4.43. 4.43. Let's add one more decimal. Now note that's different if I go back to the 4.2 something, 4.3 about. That's different than the 4.51, which you would expect it to get. So we're working with only 30 years or yearly amounts instead of the 360 monthly amounts, which will give you those approximate numbers, which can be usable and be a little bit easier to work with if you're doing more in-depth analysis. But again, there's going to be approximations due to that as well. So if I go back on over, we're going to say, all right, that's going to be, just so we can kind of understand this a little bit more, let's try to say what would happen if I use that IRR. That IRR is the rate at which this series of payments would be 0. So in other words, just to prove that, let's say we take this same thing, put that here, and let's say we're going to use now, this is going to be equal to this IRR rate, 4 point so on, and we'll add 4 points so on. So there we go. Then I'm going to say 1, 2. Let's copy that down. Copy that down to 30. And center it, alignment and center. And then the cash flow is going to be the same, that 194. Going to copy that all the way down, because I just said equal to the other cell, to 30 payments. There's not 32. And then we could do our present value calculations here. Equals present value, shift, let's say negative. Present value, shift 9, rate. That rate. And then F4 on the keyboard, making it absolute, comma, number of periods is going to be, hold on a second. I need to make my period start at 0, 1, 2, 0, 1, 2, and then we'll copy it down to 30. Try it again. This one needs to be copied down. Okay, let's try it now. We're going to say negative present value, shift 9, rate is going to be that 4.426, F4 on the keyboard, making it absolute, comma, number of periods is going to be 1, representing 1 year this time, comma, comma, because it's not an annuity, but present value of 1, future value 11,807. In other words, if we discount the 11,807 at the 4.426 1 year back, we get to the 11,307. Double clicking the fill handle. There we have it. Copying this up. There we have it. Now we could just sum this up. This is going to be the total. Equals the SUM of this column. And then I'm going to copy that over to get to the sum of the second column. And we get to 0 now. In other words, the IRR, if I take the IRR, equals the IRR of this column, is going to be, we're going to say number group is going to be that 4.426, right? So we discounted it back using the IRR, which means the series of payments is going to be 0. That's kind of what it means for that to, in essence, be the effective rate. Kind of proves it to be the effective rate. But notice it plays out over the 30-year time period. So if we start to go to questions in the future and say, well, what happens if I only have this loan for 7 years or something like that? It gets a little bit confusing when we start to do our comparisons then, because now we're talking about loans that are 30 years long that we only expect to have for 7 years that are going to have a balance at the end of that time, and so on and so forth. So that could be easier to do with an approximation of like 30 years and get some idea about what's going to happen if you're doing some more in-depth analysis than if you're trying to work with a 360 period amortization table, even though that would be a bit more exact. So we'll do some more of that in the future. We'll do some more comparisons now that we have our tools down and hopefully a better understanding of, the IRR, the effective rate, and when these things might be used. Okay, so let's go ahead and format these, do some formatting. Going to make this bracketed, home tab, font group, bracket, put some blue on it, bracket and blue it. Do this one too, do the good old bracket and blue thing that we've been doing. Selecting these items, we're going to font group blue and bracket. Let's do it for this one as well. Do the blue and the blue and bracket. We're going to blue and bracket, font group, brackets, blue and bracket. And then we'll put some underlines on these ones to make them look a little nicer. Font group underline. I'm going to try to make these, I'm holding down Control so that I can select those at the same time and basically make them possibly the same width just to make that look nicer. Way nicer. Way nicer. Okay. So that's just another idea. Now we can use these tools to go in the future and start answering questions. Well, how long would I have to keep the loan in order for it to be beneficial? And what if I was to compare a loan that had points that I had to pay $6,000 to pay down the points versus a loan that doesn't, or a loan that has different point things? How can I compare, and so on and so forth? Now that we have our tools down, we'll dive in more so to some of those questions.